Gary Heidnik popped open the champagne and began pouring it out into 5 cups. He watched the women down their drinks, although he hardly touched his own. Gary didn't really like drinking, but he did want to celebrate. He was excited and pleased with himself because he believed that 2 of his women, Josephine and Sandra, might be pregnant. After the drinks, Gary grabbed a bag of Chinese takeout and he began setting the feast out onto the table. He enjoyed seeing the women gape at the food in disbelief. Now they would see just how generous he could be when they deserved it. The women sat in silence as they ate. Nobody was in the mood for conversation. The only noise they could hear, besides the radio Gary insisted on blasting, was the rattle of their chains that bound both their ankles and their wrists. It was a horrific sound, one that haunted their dreams as it was a constant reminder of their captivity. It was a sound they could never, ever escape. Hey guys, welcome to the newest episode of the Always Talking Crime podcast. I am Kimmy. I am really excited that you're here. If this is your first time listening to this podcast, hell yeah, welcome bitches. I'm super excited that you found me. You found my little podcast. And if you're a returning listener, hell yeah, welcome back, bitches. Anyways, so I had a little bit of craziness last week. Some of you know that I was forced to release a Patreon episode from my vault, and instead of having this episode released last week. So there's going to be 2 parts, okay? This is part 1. Obviously, I'm sure you saw it when you read the subject. And tomorrow, you're going to be getting part 2. I'm not the type of girl that's going to make you wait an entire week for the second part, because I really dislike it when my favorite podcasts do that to me. Usually what I do is I don't even listen to part 1 until part 2 comes out. So I switch to a different podcast or anything. But anyways, guys, I'm never going to make you wait that long, okay? So you're going to get them 2 days in a row, back to back. And I'm so excited. I'm really hopeful that my storage issue is taken care of. You will not believe it, but last week, I already recorded this episode 3 times, and every time I tried to save it, it wouldn't save, and then I lost it. It disappeared because there was no place to save it to. So then I'd have to find some more free time and try it again, and it just kept happening. It was super frustrating, but I'm fairly certain that I figured out the problem. And so I'm just gonna put it out there. Yes, I'm gonna manifest it. I have figured out the problem and I'm not gonna have any more issues. But anyways, this week's episode is going to cover how this guy Gary Heidnik experienced decades of mental illness and violent episodes before he committed his first murder. For most of his adult life, there were so many warning signs that he was capable of harming others. But there weren't any doctors, family members, or law enforcement officers that seemed able to keep Gary out of trouble. Eventually, his crimes would send shockwaves throughout the city of Philadelphia. This case really, I think, shows how, in many ways, we've completely failed as a society, because a lot of times the warning signs are right there in front of our eyes and we choose to ignore them. And I'm going to give you guys some trigger warnings due to the graphic natures of this motherfucker's crimes that I'm going to be telling you about. I need to give you trigger warnings while I remember to do so. I mean, I know it's a true crime podcast. You should expect a bunch of nasty fucking shit. But here they are. Trigger warnings for animal abuse, murder, sexual assault, rape, violence, torture, mutilation. Yeah, I think that's it. But it's nasty, okay? So some of you may find this offensive. Some of you may choose not to listen to this case. It's cool. I'll catch you next time if this is not your thing, okay? But there are so many trigger warnings. All the trigger warnings. All right, guys, let's go for it. Gary Michael Heidnik was born in November of 1943. His father, Michael, worked as a machinist, and he also served as the city councilman. His mother, Ellen, was a beautician. The family lived in a quiet suburb in Cleveland, Ohio, but things were far from perfect. When Gary was just 2 years old, his parents divorced. It wasn't an amicable divorce at all. Both of Gary's parents blamed the other one for the failed marriage. Michael claimed that Ellen's alcoholism was the cause, but Ellen accused Michael of a gross neglect of duty. Whatever the fuck that means, I'm not sure. But anyways, after the divorce, Gary and his younger brother, you ready for it? Terry, Gary and Terry, they lived with their mother. Terry would later recall that at some point during these early years, Gary had had a dangerous fall from a tree. He supposedly suffered a severe head injury, and that left his skull permanently deformed. Afterwards, childhood bullies teased him at school, calling him football head. We all know that kids can be assholes, okay? According to his brother, Gary's personality changed after that fall. It seemed as though Gary had developed a cruel streak all of a sudden. He'd once enjoyed feeding wild animals that wandered onto their property, but after that accident, Gary began torturing the animals instead. He would trap them, tie them up, and then hang them from trees. He also started getting into fights with Terry and other kids in the neighborhood. It's very possible that this fall affected Gary for the rest of his life. There are numerous studies out there that have linked early traumatic head injuries with future incidences of violent crime. A traumatic head injury can disrupt development of the brain systems, like the systems that control regulation of emotions, and that in turn can lead to impulsiveness and poor social judgment. These behavioral problems have also been linked to future crime and incarceration. That being said, we are all aware that trauma doesn't have to be physical in order to leave a lasting impact. Gary's home life was unstable while he was growing up, which might also have impacted his development quite a bit. His mother cared for him for a few years after his parents' divorce, like I already said, but Ellen reportedly had difficulty controlling her heavy drinking. So after a few years, she ended up returning the boys to their father, and unfortunately, this was not much of an improvement. Allegedly, Michael Heidnik was a harsh disciplinarian who frequently beat his sons, and he kept them in line by the use of humiliating punishments. Gary had a problem with wetting the bed, and it's been reported that his father made him hang those pissy soiled sheets out of his second-story bedroom window so that the entire neighborhood would see them. And when his father was really angry, he'd grab one of his sons by the ankles and dangle him out of the bedroom window. Whenever one of the boys misbehaved, their father liked to paint a bull's eye on the seat of their pants before sending them to school. That way, all of the kids in school would kick them at some point during the school day. So he definitely was not trying to go for the Father of the Year award. It was certainly more like he was the fuckface of the year, you know? But anyways, Michael Heidnik remarried, but the children found very little comfort in their new stepmother, Dorothea. Dorothea had no interest in parenting. In fact, Gary said that Dorothea hated him, and she would single him out repeatedly so that he would get more and more of his father's punishments. Not surprising at all, the abuse took its toll. Gary's life may have appeared normal to most outsiders. He was in the Boy Scouts, and he had a paper route like other kids did. But some members of the community did notice that he seemed more withdrawn than his peers. One of his father's coworkers commented that Gary never seemed to go to dances, and he didn't play sports. So, unlike other boys his age, he was more of a loner. Gary and Terry even tried to run away to California, but they were caught by the police and sent back home. And sometime after this is when Gary's father enrolled him in a school in Virginia, a school called the Stanton Military Academy. Gary attended Stanton for 2 years, and he did quite well. He earned good grades, and he stayed out of trouble. But he left suddenly after his junior year. For some reason, and it's totally unclear as to why, Gary suddenly went back to live with his father and attended the local high school instead. His relationship with his father did not improve at all when he returned home. It's very possible and probable that around this time, Gary had failed an entrance exam to West Point Academy. Michael more than likely would have been furious at such an outcome, but Gary had probably had enough at that point. He decided that it was time to leave his father's house for good. So at the age of 17, Gary dropped out of high school in October of 1961 and enlisted in the U.S. Army. Initially, Gary seemed to do really well in the military. He had wanted to become a military police officer, but was turned down because he was deemed to be too young. Instead, he began his training to become a medic. In May of 1962, Gary was assigned to the 46th Army Surgical Hospital in Landstuhl, West Germany. He was there to provide medical support, but it wasn't long before Gary began to experience health problems of his own. Gary claimed that while he was in Germany, the Army performed experiments on him using LSD, and that he suffered a nervous breakdown as a result of this. Now, there aren't any records of such testing in his file, but it's absolutely possible that Gary was telling the truth. The U.S. Army did conduct secret hallucinogenic drug research on American soldiers during the Cold War, most famously at the Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. And it's not like they're going to put that in his record. If it's like a secret research, they're not going to list it in his fucking file. But whatever the case, Gary went to visit a doctor. He was experiencing dizziness, headaches, blurred vision, and nausea. His doctor referred him to a neurologist who noted that Gary displayed signs of mental illness, possibly schizophrenia or schizoid personality disorder. Soon after that, 18-year-old Gary was transferred back to the United States. He was sent to a military hospital in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, and was treated for mental health problems. His doctors found that he was experiencing hallucinations on top. I don't know why I can't say that word. Hallucinations on top of all of his other symptoms. Meanwhile, an Army board reviewed Gary's case and determined that he should be honorably discharged. With that, sadly, Gary's military career was over. After just 14 months of service, he left the Army. Gary was issued a 100% disability rating, which meant he was entitled to the maximum amount in monthly benefits, according to my research. This benefit rating is usually reserved for individuals who, I guess, are basically virtually unemployable after leaving the military. Even so, Gary did try to get work in February of 1964. He moved to Philadelphia and he enrolled in nursing school. He completed the program in a year and then spent some time working as a home care nurse. Between that income and his disability checks, he saved up enough money to purchase a house. Unfortunately, his mental health problems made it difficult to lead a normal life over the next few years. I had heard, I didn't put this in my notes or anything, but in some of my research, it stated that Gary had gotten fired at that job for being rude to the people that he was caring for. I guess he didn't have a really good bedside manner. Gary had attempted suicide several times. He tried everything, overdosing on tranquilizers, ingesting rat poison. He even drove his motorcycle straight into an oncoming truck. He also tried more indirect methods. During one doctor's exam, the physician found a piece of fucking string, tied tightly around one of his toes. Gary explained to his doctor that he wanted to cause gangrene. He hoped it would spread and eventually become fatal. Because of this erratic behavior, Gary spent the next several years in and out of psychiatric hospitals. He developed a number of strange behaviors, one of which being selective mutism. Sometimes he'd go weeks without speaking, and oh my God, I sometimes wish my live-in boyfriend could do that too, because he's always so loud and he's always talking. But anyways, during this period of time, Gary's younger brother Terry lived in Philadelphia, and just like Gary, Terry also had been discharged from the military due to mental illness. And just like Gary, Terry was frequently suicidal. The brothers often leaned on each other for support, but they could also definitely be each other's worst enemies. And when things turned bad, it could get violent. In December of 1968, Gary and Terry got into a fight. Gary smashed his brother's head with a wooden carpenter's tool, which left a wound that needed 16 stitches. While Terry was recovering in the hospital, Gary visited him. Terry bitterly railed against Gary, accusing his brother of nearly killing him. But Gary calmly responded that if he had killed Terry, he certainly wouldn't have just bashed him in the head. He would have placed his body into the bathtub and dissolved his bones in acid. Can you imagine somebody saying that to you? But despite Gary's threatening remarks, Terry did end up forgiving him. After all, his brother was one of the few people he could talk to, and vice versa. By this stage, the brothers had cut off contact with their father, and neither of them had spent time with their mother in years. So all they had was each other. Then tragedy hit. In 1970, their mother Ellen died by suicide. She'd been suffering from cancer, and she decided to end her life by drinking a bottle of muriatic chloride. Mercuric chloride. I can't say words. I think I can't say words, especially because I've done this same episode so many times. The whole time I'm talking, I feel like this huge sense of deja vu. But anyways, despite their estrangement from their mother, Gary made sure that she was cremated, and he spread her ashes in Niagara Falls. After this, Gary fell into a deep depression. He went back into the hospital, this time for a lengthy stay. He seemed directionless, with no plan at all for the future. In his file, one of his doctors wrote, quote, "The patient seems to be settling in for life," unquote. But Gary was soon to find a new purpose, surprisingly. Not after he was discharged in the spring of 1971, Gary left the house to get a cup of coffee and decided on a whim to just keep fucking driving. He drove all the way to California, finally coming to a stop at the beach in Malibu. It was there that he heard the voice of God talking to him. God's voice told him to start a church, one that catered towards people with intellectual disabilities. And Gary did not question it for a moment. Alrighty then. Gary returned to Philadelphia and filed articles of incorporation for his church, which he called the United Church of the Ministers of God. He and Terry launched the new church in October of 1971. From then on, he went by a new title, Bishop Gary Heidnik. Now a so-called religious leader, which to me, he sounds more like a cult leader, Gary found something he'd been lacking for most of his life, a feeling of control over others. And he found that he liked it. He liked it immensely. In Gary's new role, he had absolute power over the organization, according to the church's constitution. Gary had the final word on interpretation of the Bible and of settling religious disputes. With those rules in place, Gary went to work holding services each Sunday for a small congregation. Nearly all of them had intellectual disabilities, and most could not read. But Gary spent hours with his flock, teaching them how to memorize hymns. It's possible, but not probable, that Gary had a genuine interest in helping people. Gary's new lease on life made some of the people who knew him suspicious, though. One friend initially assumed that it was some kind of scam, a tax dodge. And to be fair, Gary did seem to have a particular interest in using the church to acquire wealth. Gary had always been fascinated by the stock market. He watched it obsessively. And in 1975, he used church funds to open an account with Merrill Lynch. Gary proved to be an astute investor, and over time, his investments earned hundreds of thousands of dollars. The money, of course, belonged to the church, but Gary retained total and absolute control over it. Money concerns aside, there were other reasons to doubt Gary's commitment to religion outside of Sunday services. His behavior revealed that he still had a violent side, always simmering just below the surface and ready to boil over at any moment. This side of Gary showed up in his dealings with a couple named Linda and Robert Rogers. They were Gary's tenants and rented the second floor of Gary's house. The Rogers were not at all sure what to make of their landlord. It seemed to Robert, who happened to be black, that 32-year-old Gary Heidnik was obsessed with race. He heard Gary make predictions that a race war would someday sweep the nation, and also saw him read racist literature from an Aryan organization. Robert found this strange, particularly because Gary, who was a white man, seemed to exclusively date black women. But Gary's odd attitudes on race were not his only concern. At that time, Gary was living with a girlfriend named Dorothy Mae Knight. Dorothy was a black woman who, due to an intellectual disability, had spent much of her life in and out of care facilities. It seemed to Robert that Gary targeted Dorothy because of her disability. Troublingly enough, this was not at all uncommon for predators. According to the Justice Department, people with intellectual disabilities become targets of sexual assault at rates more than 7 times higher than those without them. It really reminds me of the episode on David Goodrow that I did just a few weeks ago. If you haven't listened to that episode yet, you need to. It took place in my hometown, and he targeted one of his victims through his job for the Social Security Administration. Anyway, disabled victims are often people who cannot speak, or their speech is not well developed because of their intellectual disability. And people tend to not believe them, or maybe believe them to not be so credible. And because of this, a perpetrator may see a safe opportunity to victimize that person. For Gary, this was also an opportunity to reinforce his feelings of superiority and his need for control. In one of his many psychiatric reports compiled over years of treatment, Gary's doctor wrote that Gary was, quote, easily threatened by women whom he would consider to be equal to him, either intellectually or emotionally. Gary needs constant acceptance and self-assurance that he is an intelligent, worthwhile human being. But while Gary craved approval and respect, he was not capable of giving it to others. Dorothy seemed to be devoted to Gary, but he repaid her with cruelty. Linda Rogers saw that Gary constantly berated Dorothy, criticized her, beat her, and even deprived her of food. Linda and Robert tried to help, but they weren't sure how to protect Dorothy, and they were wary of crossing their volatile landlord, and with good reason. In the fall of 1976, Gary had gotten into an argument with Linda. In retaliation, Gary decided to shut off all of the utilities in the building. That's a dick move for sure. When Robert found out about this, he tried to get into the basement so that he could turn the power back on, but found the door locked. Annoyed, Robert went outside and found a window leading to the cellar, so he opened it up and started to climb in. But once inside, however, he found himself face to face with Gary. I'll call him Scary Gary. His landlord had been lying there in wait for him. Gary was armed with a rifle and a pistol, and he told Robert that he was going to shoot him and tell the police he'd caught a burglar. Before Robert could retreat, Gary raised the pistol and fired. The bullet grazed Robert's cheekbone just below his left eye. He wasn't seriously injured, but he wondered if Gary was about to start his predicted race war with Robert being his first victim. Robert managed to talk Gary into letting him go. He went on to report the incident, but for some reason, it was not listed in any public records. The aggravated assault charges were dropped. Gary never faced any consequences for the attack. Shortly after this incident, Gary sold the house, and when the new buyers took their first tour of the property, they were dismayed to find the place littered with garbage, pornography, and spent bullet casings. But they found something even stranger in the basement. There was a large hole excavated into the concrete floor. It had a depth of about 3 feet, and it was just large enough for a person to fit inside. They wondered what on earth Gary had intended to do with that hole. But since it was empty, the new owners just decided to fill it in and forget all about it. Like, can you imagine, buying a house and finding that? That's craziness. Anyways, meanwhile, Gary's behavior took an even more disturbing turn. You'd think that it couldn't seem possible, but Gary is about to double down on his douchiness. Once he'd sold his house, Gary moved in with another girlfriend, and just like Dorothy, Anjanette was a black woman with an intellectual disability. She was reportedly unable to read or write. This made her an easy target for Gary, who seemed to exercise total control over her life. Sometime in 1977, Anjanette became pregnant. Gary refused to let her seek medical treatment for months until her family called the police to intervene when her older sister finally took her to a doctor just a month before her due date. They learned that Anjanette had only gained 5 pounds during her pregnancy because apparently Gary had put her on a strict diet. What a fuckface. Despite Gary's destructive caregiving, Anjanette ended up delivering a healthy baby girl in March of 1978. Authorities immediately placed the baby into foster care due to her mother's disability and Gary's history of mental illness. Gary was furious. As far as Gary was concerned, that baby belonged to him, and nobody had the right to take his family away from him. After his baby girl was placed into foster care, Gary began plotting another way to have children. In May, Gary and Anjanette drove to the Salins Grove Center in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. This is where Anjanette's sister Alberta was a resident. Alberta had significant intellectual disabilities, and she was not capable at all of living on her own. Gary and Anjanette obtained a day pass to allow Alberta to leave the facility for a short family visit, but they never came back. When they hadn't returned by the following morning, officials at the center grew worried. You think? When Alberta still hadn't returned over a week later, her caregivers were frantic. They went looking for her at Gary and Anjanette's apartment in Philadelphia, hoping to find her safe. It was Gary who answered the door. He told the center employees that he had given Alberta a bus ticket and sent her back to Harrisburg. Then he invited them in to look around so that he could prove that she wasn't there. The employees looked but couldn't find her anywhere, but they didn't believe that Gary was telling them the truth. They decided to return to the apartment the following day, this time with police. When the authorities arrived, they searched the entire fucking building. They even looked through the entire basement. They got to an empty storage room in the back, and that's when they finally found Alberta. She was trapped inside that storage room and shaking in terror. And when she spotted her caregivers from the center, she rushed over to them and she just clung to them and refused to let them go. Doctors on the scene gave the terrified woman a physical examination and found clear evidence that she'd been raped and sodomized and that she had contracted gonorrhea. Gary was immediately arrested and charged with kidnapping, rape, false imprisonment, and unlawful restraint. But Gary didn't spend the months leading up to his court date in jail. Instead, he was admitted for psychological treatment at the Veterans Hospital. By the time he faced trial in November, many of the most serious charges had been dropped because Alberta was deemed not competent to testify against him. It's totally sad, but the prosecutors felt that they would not be able to prove Gary's guilt without her testimony. Nevertheless, Judge Charles Meraki still found Gary guilty of 3 lesser charges: interference with the custody of a committed person, recklessly endangering others, and false imprisonment. He sentenced Gary to 3 to 7 years in prison. The judge also said that if it were in his power to sentence him to a longer prison term, he would have. He sensed something evil and dangerous in this defendant, and he was worried that eventually it would only get worse. And he wasn't wrong. In January of 1979, Gary began his sentence at the State Correctional Institution at Graterford, Pennsylvania. Around the same time, he was subjected to a range of psychological testing and evaluations. Records show that he was intelligent with an IQ of at least 148. But these records also indicated that he was highly manipulative, insecure, and confused. Dr. Wayne C. Blodgett was one of the psychiatrists who examined Gary just before his sentencing. He wrote that he considered Gary highly dangerous, stating that he had a, quote, high probability for serious or even bizarre offenses against relatively helpless members of the community. Dr. Blodgett also said that he hoped his report would raise a warning flag and force someone in the criminal justice system to pay special attention to Gary. However, that didn't happen in prison. Gary seemed to fly completely under the radar. One prison official said that he was easy to overlook because Gary retreated into mutism for much of his sentence. So for about 30 months, Gary rarely spoke, even to the doctors that were there to treat him. When guards asked why he wouldn't talk, Gary would just scrawl out a note telling them that the devil had stuck a cookie down his throat. Gary only began speaking again when officials told him they were terminating his parental rights so that his daughter could be adopted. Upset with this, he expressed a wish to visit her and provide support. Ultimately, his rights were terminated anyway. While Dr. Blodgett seemed concerned for the danger Gary posed to other people, others were more worried about the danger he posed to himself while in custody. Gary had attempted suicide on several different occasions. Once he even smashed a light bulb and tried to eat the crushed glass in an effort to self-harm. At several points, he was sent to state hospitals for psychiatric treatment when prison officials worried that he would harm himself. Ultimately, somehow Gary was released 3 years short of his full 7-year sentence. His parole was conditioned on him getting inpatient care at the VA hospital in Coatesville, Pennsylvania. But once he got there, his doctors didn't see any need to keep him for long. He only stayed for 3 fucking weeks. By April 12th of 1983, he was out of the hospital and let back out into society. He had no real friends or family to welcome him. His mother was dead. He was not on speaking terms with his father, and by that point, he and Terry had drifted apart. That meant that there was absolutely no one around to notice when his behavior took a more sinister turn. And before I go on with the story, I want to talk to you guys about not BetterHelp. If you listen to other podcasts, it seems like every fucking podcast that have ads talk about BetterHelp. And while I think that mental health care is important, that's not what I'm going to talk about. It's not an ad, but I have been networking with a lot of other new podcasts. And I would really, really, really love to share another favorite of mine. It's with 3 girls named Katie, Paige, and Alicia. It's called Crime Bay Podcast. They're fucking hilarious. So if you are someone that enjoys a podcast with numerous hosts, I know this one just has me, myself, and I. And when I'm drunk, it's Patricia. Patricia's there too. But anyways, check this one out. You can find them on Spotify, and everywhere. I'm going to play you their trailer, and whenever you are waiting for your next episode of Always Talking Crime or any other favorite podcast you listen to, really give these girls a listen. They are up to episode 21 right now. They started their podcast just shortly after I began mine. Let's give their trailer a listen.
I'm Katie.
I'm Paige.
And I'm Alicia.
And this is
Crime Bay.
And if you're into the dark,
Paranormal, spooky,
super weird,
mythical,
Macabre.
then this is a podcast for you. Once a week, this podcast will bring you a certain case from any number of strange, unusual, sinister, horrific, organized crime,
straight up mysterious,
whatever. If you don't like scary movies, if you don't like crime is true crime condensed, just so you know. If you don't like true crime documentaries, if you don't like funny bitches, stay away. So look out for our podcasts on Spotify,
Apple Podcasts,
And wherever you get your podcasts.
Make sure you subscribe and give us a follow so that you can be up to date on every single episode that we release.
We look forward to
Creeping It Real.
coming soon, sometime in June.
Blessing those ear holes.
That right.
I love that, blessing those ear holes. Anyways, those girls are awesome too. So seriously, be sure to give them a listen. Anyways, let's get back to our case. So after Gary's release, he bought a home on North Marshall Street in Philadelphia. It's not clear whether he worked at this time, but he often told people he was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. He liked the way that sounded because he liked to sound important. It's most likely that he was living off of his disability benefits, although he still had access to potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars from those investments through his church. With this money, he purchased a Rolls-Royce, a Cadillac, a Lincoln Continental, as well as other luxury vehicles. He used the cars and the money to try to impress women who were usually individuals with intellectual disabilities. He'd drive to fast food restaurants near the Elwyn Institute, which was a nonprofit. It serviced persons with various types of disabilities. So Gary would make sure to hang around waiting for women from that institute to stop by the restaurant. Neighbors said that they often saw Gary bringing women back to his house, sometimes even like 2 or 3 of them at a time for group sex. But these activities did not satisfy all of Gary's desires. It seems he still expressed an interest in fathering as many children as he possibly could. Perhaps he viewed a family as another sign of power, like he did his many cars, his stock accounts, and his bishop title. It's a familiar pattern that can be seen in men around the world. And impregnating women is viewed as a status symbol in patriarchal environments. For some men, fathering many children is reassuring proof of their masculinity, his potency, and virility. So Gary seemed obsessed with these kinds of status symbols, and he looked for them everywhere. Not long after leaving prison, he began corresponding with a young woman in the Philippines, and her name was Betty Tedisco. They had met through a pen pal service of some kind, and over the next 2 years, Gary courted Betty by mail and occasionally also by telephone. He told her that he was a clergyman looking for a wife. To Betty, he seemed like an ideal candidate for marriage. And in September of 1985, she received a visa and flew to the United States. She and Gary were married 3 days after her arrival. Side note, This makes me think of the show 90 Day Fiancé. That show, I don't know if you've seen it or not. Okay, listener, have you seen it? It's such a fucking train wreck, but me and my boyfriend watch it and we just laugh. In fact, like, we paraphrase it and we quote it in our like daily life far too often. More often than is normal, but it's fucking funny. But anyways, almost immediately after getting married, Betty found herself living in a fucking nightmare. Just 1 week into their marriage, she caught Gary having sex with not one, not two, but 3 women he brought back to their home. He told her that this was how marriages worked in America. He explained to her that he was always going to sleep with other women and that she should consider herself lucky since he had chosen her to marry. When Betty objected, he punched her and forced her to stand in the corner for 14 hours. For the next few months, Betty endured Gary's horrific treatment. He beat her, he raped her, he forced her to sleep on the dirty floor, he deprived her of food, and he mocked her. She watched him have sex with other women. It was relentless. Soon, Betty discovered that she was pregnant. At this point, she realized she could not possibly bear Gary's abuse any longer. In mid-January of 1986, Betty placed her passport and a change of clothes into a bag and she hid it behind some bushes in front of the house. A little while later, she told Gary she was going out shopping. Instead, she grabbed that bag and she escaped to a women's shelter. 2 weeks after her escape, Betty obtained a protection order which barred Gary, who by now was 42 years old, from physically striking, harassing, or threatening her in any way. Go Betty. Betty the badass. Betty the badass bitch. In her petition, Betty stated that by calling himself a bishop, Gary was using his position of authority to seduce women, and she was not wrong. Betty also reported Gary to the police. Soon, the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office charged Gary with spousal rape, indecent assault, and simple assault. But on the day of the preliminary hearing, Betty never showed up. Perhaps she was too frightened. And without her testimony, the charges against Gary ended up being dropped. In September of 1986, Betty gave birth to a son, and understandably, she didn't want Gary anywhere near them. Once again, Gary felt like he'd been denied his right to a family. He became even more determined to take what he desired by any means necessary. 2 months later, he made his move. On the night of November 26th, 1986, a 25-year-old sex worker by the name of Josefina Rivera stood on a corner near northeast Philadelphia, and she was scouting out potential customers. As she shivered in the cold, a gleaming white Cadillac pulled up beside her. Gary Heidnik, of course, was behind the wheel. Gary complimented Josephine, telling her that he thought she looked like Diana Ross. He offered to pay $20 for her company, and she joined him inside the car. Gary then drove to a nearby McDonald's restaurant and ordered coffee. Then he asked Josephine if she'd come back to his place. Josephine usually didn't like going home with her clients. She would have preferred a brief encounter inside his car, but she was a single mother to 3 children and she was desperate for the cash, so she agreed to go. When they got to his house on Marshall Street, she felt very apprehensive. It was a strange place. There were pennies glued to the walls in the kitchen, which is fucking weird, and both $1 and $5 bills were pasted on some of the walls upstairs. It's like totally weird as fuck. Despite all the things her subconscious was telling her, she followed Gary to his bedroom anyway. He paid her the $20 he'd promised. Then they got into bed and had consensual sex. Afterwards, Gary got up to get dressed and Josephine turned to reach for her own clothes. But as she grabbed her jeans, she felt Gary's hands wrapping around her throat. Just as she was beginning to pass out, he let go. By the time she was able to understand what the fuck was going on, he had ordered her to stand up and put her hands behind her back. Terrified, Josephine obeyed. A moment later, she felt the cold metal of a pair of handcuffs lock around her wrist. Gary forced her down one set of stairs and then another all the way down to the basement, and that's when he guided her to an old mattress that was lying on the floor. He then reached into a nearby cardboard box and pulled out a pair of metal muffler clamps, the kind that, are meant to fit around a car's exhaust pipe. Gary tightened those clamps around Josephine's ankles. Then he grabbed a metal chain and secured one end to the clamps and then looped the other around a pipe that was running along the ceiling. So Josephine was trapped and she was chained up like a fucking prisoner. She was frozen in fear, but one sight was more terrifying than anything else she could see. There was a large hole in the concrete floor. Josephine didn't know what the hole was for, but for all she knew, she was staring at her own grave. Chained to the wall, Josephine thought she was going to die, but she was soon going to find out. Gary had other plans. Once she was securely restrained, he moved to the center of the room. As Josephine watched, Gary grabbed a shovel and began scooping up dirt, making the pit on the basement floor even larger. He talked to her as he dug, explaining that he wanted to have kids, and lots of them. He told her he had tried starting a family before, but the state had intervened and removed the child from his custody. Gary was still fuming about that injustice. Even in her terror, Josephine could tell that Gary was an intensely lonely man. He wanted children to fill the void, telling Josephine that the world owed him these babies. So he intended to bring 10 women down to his basement, hold them captive, and impregnate each one of them. He told Josephine that they would be one big happy family. He seemed thrilled by the idea of having a collection of women and children who were totally and absolutely 100% dependent on him. And guys, that's going to be the end of part 1. I don't want to say I hope you've enjoyed it. If you're a true crime lover, I hope you're kind of sitting on the edge of your seat like, what the fuck is going to happen next? Let me just tell you, it gets worse before it gets better. But just know, I'm not going to make you wait a whole week to find out. I'm not going to make you wait a whole week. All right, guys. So I'm going to pour myself a glass of wine or another glass of wine. I've had one so far. I'm going to go pour myself another glass, and I'm going to record the second episode while I have privacy. And privacy is hard to come by. Let me tell you. It is a struggle bus, and I am driving it. But anyways, I'm home by myself. My boyfriend's out at dinner with his kids, his adult kids, and he's meeting the dad of his soon-to-be, I think. They're not engaged yet or anything, but I think it's going to be his soon-to-be daughter-in-law. So they're out. I didn't want to go because, I have this podcast and I wasn't able to record it due to all my chaos with my storage and everything. So I am committed to you, and I am staying home, drinking wine and recording true crime. But anyways, just know you only have to wait one day to get the second part. So Sunday part 1, Monday part 2, then you only have 6 days left until the next episode. I love you guys. I really appreciate all of you who listen, all of you who reach out, all of you who rate, my podcast. I really love the ones that rate it 5 stars. I love the reviews. I love when you guys reach out to me and recommend a case. I just love everything. And I really, really love the other podcasts, the new podcasts that I've been networking with. You know who you are. If you are listening, I appreciate you guys so very much. I learn a lot from you guys, and I hope you learn a little bit from me as well. So anyways, with that being said, I'm going to let you go till next time. Until then, you know what I'm going to say. Say it with me. Keep talking crime.